Good evening, Black people and all allies fighting for Black liberation, Black prosperity, and Black joy. I'm Charles Blow, and welcome to Prime. Approaching 1 year since taking office, President Biden has given an unusually low number of interviews to the press. Biden has sat down for just 11 one-on-one interviews since he was inaugurated, including a CNN town hall with Niambi Cooper 2 weeks ago. He fields questions from reporters at events, but the number of one-on-one interviews Biden has given trails far behind his predecessors. Presidential historian and former CBS reporter Mark Knoller noted last month that at this same point in his presidency, Barack Obama gave 131 interviews. Donald Trump, a man who treated journalists with unprecedented hostility, participated in 55 at this point. Many of the biggest donors to Biden's 2020 campaign are also feeling ghosted by the president. In interviews with more than 30 donors, financiers, and operatives, the New York Times reported some of the top Democratic contributors are frustrated by the lack of communication with the White House, as well as the lack of progress on spending deals and voting rights legislation. Engagement from the White House has been so sparse that some donors presume Biden doesn't even plan on running in 2024. The president's advisors describe these as ordinary and temporary grumblings donors have. To Biden's credit, presidents should be focused more on being president than appeasing their wealthiest donors. But in a moment when the Biden administration has yet to follow through on the promises made during the 2020 campaign, especially for the Black voters who helped to put him in office, the question stands: where is Joe? Joining me now to discuss, Brittney Cooper, professor of women's studies at Rutgers, and Niambi Carter, associate professor of political science at Howard University. Professor Cooper, what do you make of the fact that Biden is simply not giving interviews to the press at a time when his presidency is really under stress? People are begging him to use the bully pulpit more than he is.
I think we need to reset the room a little bit. I think that Biden wants to be seen as a guy who is getting work done, who is cutting deals behind the scene, who is trying to reestablish America's, place on the world stage. And one of the things that I think Biden also understands is that we are a country where folks don't believe politicians anymore, and more talk is not the thing that's going to convince them. People are looking for him to get some things done, and he is seen as a deal maker. And so, quite frankly, I think one of the calculations may be, what conversation do I need to be having until I can get infrastructure through both the bipartisan bill and the reconciliation bill? And I kind of respect that, quite frankly. I also think that his presidency is really different than Barack Obama's presidency, where people were fascinated with a Black man in office, and Donald Trump the only thing he could do is win his presidency and his support in the media. And I think Joe Biden has other sort of places that he can stand. And so I'm a person who thinks, like, I like to see him sort of going on the local circuit, trying to convince local communities that are going to be critical to the vote that the kinds of policies he's trying to enact matter. And I think we should be paying attention to that.
Dr. Carter, I want to get your opinion on that. I kind of follow Brittney's thinking up to a point, but if he were actually getting the things done, like if he were behind the scenes not saying anything and it actually was the things were passing, I believe I'd follow that more. Do you believe, however, that actually going out and talking is part of the way that you can get things done? Because at least at that point, you're putting public pressure onto people, and public pressure also matters because it helps to affects the voters who are going to vote for you in your district, as well as just talking to you behind the scenes and nobody ever sees that.
Well, I mean, I don't disagree with Dr. Cooper, but I also think, the bully pulpit is important. I mean, I think lots of people wanted him to have some sort of outside impact on that conversation around infrastructure, around voting rights, and wanted him to really shame, quite frankly, his co-partisans, but also his partisans on the other side of the aisle into doing something for the American people. And I think people feel like Biden hasn't been doing enough to really use that power. But I think you have to remember that while he was number two to Barack Obama for 8 years, he comes at this as a legislator. He was a senator for far longer. And so he really views his job in some ways as a legislator. And I think it's probably really frustrating for someone like Joe Biden, who wants to be in the room and making the deals and not simply being the person who signs off on them. And he's had to sort of, share that power with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, for good or for ill. And I think, Joe Biden is still one of these people who believes that he can sort of do this gentle goading and things will move along. But we've crossed that bridge and we've been over it. And I think what people want is to see him look more powerful by just saying more things. I don't know that that makes him look more powerful. I think he actually has a lot more to answer for that perhaps he doesn't want to talk about, because I don't know that people would be satisfied with what he would have to say. And that just might be more fodder, right, for people to talk about all the ways he's failed, as they're already doing, because they're like, oh, look at his poll numbers, they're sliding. So clearly he's a failure. Well, why talk about it and give people more reason to say that and give them quotes to go with it? So I think Biden might actually be thinking about a 2024 run, and saying less might actually suit him better than saying more.
Well, Dr. Cooper, the donors don't think he's running in 2024 because he's not talking to them, and they're the ones who are going to have to give the money. But just to another point, you brought up an interesting point about Barack Obama and the way that he needed to, he was a kind of a specialty, the new shiny thing, and therefore he talked more and more people wanted to talk to him. I don't think there's any shortage of people who want to talk to Joe Biden, quite frankly. We'd have him on this show at any moment that he would want to do it. We'd stop right now in the middle of his interview and have him on if he called in. There's no shortage of people who want to talk to Joe Biden. Joe Biden does not want to talk to them. And I think, even in the early Obama days, they were beginning to talk about passing health care reform. He was not just going in these interviews and just, doing frills. He was actually talking policy in the middle of these one-on-one interviews. Do you not think that some of that would be helpful to Biden as well, to lay out the case over and over again in every press that you could, particularly in niche press? If you want to talk to the Hispanic community, you need to go on Univision or Telemundo. If you want to talk to the black community directly, you need to talk to some more black journalists. That's just not happening.
Look, I think that one of the things we're also living in the aftermath of is the way that we were always in a Trump media barrage. And so every single day, Trump was driving the stories in the media. And I think it changed our perception about what presidents ought to do and how much they should be talking to us, right? But I also want to push back on the idea. One of the problems that I think happens in the media cycle is, Biden hasn't been in office for even a year, but he had huge wins on getting us to a particular place with the coronavirus, making vaccines widely available, giving people access to those additional child tax credits that they could claim on their taxes, stimulus money, right? And so it's so interesting that our narrative of his less than year in office is that he hasn't actually achieved anything big. And look, Biden wasn't my first choice in the primary. So this is not me being like a booster for Biden. It's me saying, why are we also succumbing to the media narrative that because he hasn't gotten his entire agenda passed in year one of his presidency, that he hasn't actually achieved huge gains in terms of changing the societal conversation about how the government ought to expand the social safety net. Now, do I think, to your point, that Biden should come out and make this case in the media? Sure, but he's not a Barack Obama, right? He's not hyper articulate. And so that is not actually his strong suit. And he doesn't have devotees because he's not a cult leader like Trump. So I think he has a different strategy. I think that Dr. Carter is right, that he does see himself as the backroom deal maker, and he wants to come out and have the victory lap. He doesn't see himself as a guy that tries to win in the bully pulpit and then also win in those back rooms. And I think we have to consider what that means, because we're at a moment of low public trust. And so I'm thinking about the black community who says, look, don't talk about it, be about it. I don't want to hear all this yapping. I want to know what you're doing. And so I'm not convinced that the shutting out of the media or not talking to the media is actually a bad strategy. And it's also really important that we remember that you don't govern for donors even if you need them. And whenever Biden decides to mount a campaign, he'll reconnect with those folks and they will be fine. But his immediate priority is getting something done for our folks. And that's what I want him to be doing.
Beautiful term of art, by the way. He's not hyper-articulate. So, Dr. Carter, Press Secretary Jen Psaki told CNN's David Axelrod on his podcast that the staff doesn't recommend Biden take questions and often tells him not to take them. Is part of this, the White House also doesn't believe that he is hyper articulate and that he could put his foot in his mouth if he talks.
Well, look, we know Joe Biden is a gaffe machine. When he goes off script, he does not do very well. I mean, he's put his foot in his mouth over and over and over again. We have to also remember he has a speech impediment. And I think many people forget that. And you see glimmers of it sometimes, particularly under duress or under stress. And of course, it's something that people glom onto, and people view those kinds of missteps as weakness. People read that as some sort of defect, and it's not the case, but that's how people see it. So I actually think what the press office is doing is their job, which is sort of insulating the president from those kinds of criticisms. And we can look at just the campaign trail. Joe Biden said lots of things that were off the cuff that many people sort of winced at. And even through his many years in office, we can say, oh, goodness, that was not a good look for Joe Biden. So I think people recognize that President Biden, particularly those who work most intimately with him and whose job it is to kind of protect him from his own mouth, quite frankly, know that he can have a little verbal diarrhea from time to time and say things that are either impolitic or that speech impediment he has a stutter, can make itself more apparent at different points in times, and people want him to project strength at all times. And we live in a culture and a society that does not view people who have any kind of different abilities as particularly strong. So I think that's why you see them asking him not to take questions.
Professors Brittney Cooper and Niambi Carter, thank you so much for joining me tonight.